In this video, I'll be showing you guys how to build model lungs and how air pressure makes us breathe. If you guys wanted to make one of these models on your own, you would need a plastic bottle with a top, a straw, tape, scissors, and balloons. I also used a hot glue gun to make some of my pieces stick together a little bit better. So before I even started recording, I drilled a hole in the top of my bottle cap to fit my straw later. Then I took my knife, you could also use a pair of scissors, which might actually be easier, and I cut off the bottom half of the bottle. And that bottom half can just be put off to the side. You won't actually use that. You guys will see my mom and my brothers and probably my dogs walking around in the background. Sorry about that. Next, I took my bendy straw, and you could just do it with the one side of the straw, but I wanted this to even kind of look like lungs, so I cut a small slit in the side of the bendy straw so that I could attach the other part so I could have two balloons for my lungs. Here, I'm just checking to make sure the air would actually flow through both of them. And then I had my brother help me by hot gluing the pieces together while I held them. And then we had our finished product after the glue dried, and then I just blew into it to make sure that the air would actually flow through both sides. I cut them down just a little bit, and I used water balloons just because they fit the straw better, and I didn't have to use any tape. And I put one water balloon on each one. I was just checking to make sure it would work. And then I put the straw into the bottle and I wedged it through the hole in the cap. And then I took a little bit of hot glue and just put it around the edge so that no air would leak out, and to also make sure the straw stayed in place. This next part was a little tricky, so I took a regular balloon and tied off the end and cut a little bit off the top, and I took a lot more takes than just this one to get it on the bottom of the bottle. And then I just taped down the sides so that it wouldn't come off the bottle because I had to do a lot of takes to get this to look the way it did, and I did not want it coming off. And then we had our finished product. So in the next section of this video, I'm going to explain why this works the way it does. First, we have to understand a little bit about air pressure, which is how hard air pushes against a surface. At Earth's surface, air pressure is kind of like a human pyramid. At the bottom, closest to Earth's surface, is where you have the most pressure, and that's because those air molecules, like the people on the bottom of the pyramid, are holding up the rest of them. So just like the people in the pyramid, the air pressure up higher is a lot lower because those don't have other air molecules or people sitting on top of them. In the middle is where the pressure is also in the middle, and then on the bottom, where they're holding up the most other people or most other air molecules, that's where it is the highest. If we could see air molecules, we would see that they're constantly moving in random directions. They bump into each other, and when they're in a container, they also bump into the walls. In a larger container, they bump into the walls less frequently. That means that they exert less pressure. So in a larger container, there's typically less pressure. In a smaller container at the same temperature, with the same amount of air molecules, there will be a higher pressure because there's less space for them to move around and they bounce into the container more frequently. So when there is a larger container, there is a lower pressure. And when there is a smaller container, there is a higher pressure. It is also important to know that air typically flows from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. So how does this all relate to our model lungs? When we pull down on the bottom balloon, that makes the container larger. When we make the container larger, the pressure drops, making the pressure lower on the inside than the outside, so air will move in. When we push the bottom balloon up, it makes the container smaller and increases the pressure. So pressure inside our balloon lungs is higher than it is outside. That makes the air want to move from the inside to the outside where the pressure is lower. Now that you know a little bit more about pressure, let's check out our model. Here, the straw represents our trachea, or windpipe, and where it branches, that represents the two bronchi that lead to the lungs. Here, the small balloons represent the lungs, and the large balloon represents the muscle called the diaphragm. When most people think of breathing, they think of our lungs. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the diaphragm is what does most of the work that actually allows us to breathe in and out. It does that by changing the pressure in the chest cavity. When the diaphragm contracts, it pulls down. That causes the lungs to inflate because it decreases the pressure. And as you know, a decrease in pressure means that air will rush in. When the diaphragm relaxes, it goes back to its normal position and the lungs deflate. That is because when the diaphragm relaxes, it makes the chest cavity smaller. And a smaller container will have a higher pressure. So the air rushes out of the lungs to where the pressure is lower. And that is how breathing happens. I'm sure with everything that you guys have heard about COVID-19, you've heard of a ventilator. What a ventilator does is it's actually a machine that does a person's breathing for them. So as we've established, normally we breathe with our diaphragm, by our diaphragm contracting to decrease pressure so air rushes in, and then relaxing so that pressure increases and air rushes out. What a ventilator does is it just blows air into the lungs. So the diaphragm isn't doing any work. And it just works by the ventilator pushing air through the windpipe and into the lungs. Kind of like if I were to just blow into the straw, the lungs would inflate. And that is how a ventilator works, by just pushing air into the lungs.